Tens of thousands of Canadians show up to protest against forced vaccines in Montreal. Things get ugly at a Trudeau rally, and Justin Trudeau uses this all to his advantage. I'm Candice Malcolm, and this is The Candice Malcolm Show. Hi everyone, thank you so much for tuning in. I hope you had a wonderful long weekend with your family. I hope you had a great summer as well. Summer is over and we're now into the final stretch of the campaign. So conventional wisdom sort of goes that Canadians don't really pay attention to politics in between elections, and even during elections, they don't really pay attention until the final 2 weeks or so. So we've been hearing Liberals say all along that the campaign doesn't really start until after Labor Day, and that is when the Liberals are going to start unleashing their real campaign. Well, now that Labor Day is over, we are starting to see the Liberals unleash their real campaign. And let me just tell you, the Liberals have gone negative, and I mean really negative. They're throwing the kitchen sink at Aaron O'Toole to see what sticks. They're throwing everything at him, and they're really desperately trying to throw the Conservatives off their game. They're throwing all the typical attacks against Conservatives that we've been seeing for a very long time. So first it was abortion, then private healthcare. They started calling Aaron O'Toole anti-science, and now they're claiming that he'd allow assault weapons back onto Canadian streets. Well, this is the same line of attack that the Liberals have been using against the Conservatives for decades, literally decades. It's pure desperation on behalf of the Liberals, and they're unleashing what is a really heavily negative campaign. But let me just say, heavily negative campaigns could just work in Justin Trudeau's favor. Look, Trudeau doesn't want to run a campaign against a moderate politician like Aaron O'Toole. He doesn't. He wants to run against an extremist. But since Aaron O'Toole is not an extremist, Justin Trudeau has to invent one. Because Trudeau cannot run a campaign where the focus is on himself. Trudeau can't run a campaign and win a campaign that focuses on his own record, on his ability to manage the country, or for his vision for Canada. He can only win a campaign where he demonizes and divides. And that's why he's writing off the estimated 50,000 Canadians who rallied in the streets of Montreal over the weekend to protest against vaccine mandates. Just look at these crowds. Look at these people. All of these people showing up in Montreal, of all places, to protest against medical tyranny. These are Canadians of all walks of life, of diverse backgrounds and ethnicities, who came out to protest against heavy-handed government decisions in the name of medicine, in the name of science. These are tens of thousands of freedom-loving Canadians who are using their voice, using their right to peaceful assembly to say enough is enough. This is an incredible thing, and God bless these Canadians. But instead of wall-to-wall coverage, instead of journalists on the ground trying to get to know these protesters, understanding what they're about, telling their stories and being inspired by the number of people who came out to join this movement, instead, the media did one of two things. They either completely ignored it, or they demonized these people as anti-science, extremists, far-right, or anti-vaxxers. Now, just think about this for a second. When there was large protests against climate change, the ones that were led by Greta, the angry teenage environmentalist, a couple of years ago, the global media applauded her. Her anger, her paranoia, her catastrophic alarmism all made her a global celebrity. A few years later, the exact same thing happened with Black Lives Matter. Many Americans were angry at the perception of police brutality, and specifically police brutality against Black people. Well, the far left used this anger to launch a social movement that led to countless police departments being defunded, which then resulted in a huge spike in crime. But again, the legacy media were there to cheerlead, to insist that the riots and looting were actually just peaceful protests, and to cheer on these large, angry protesters. And then once again, this past summer here in Canada, we saw over 50 churches get vandalized and burnt to the ground. Meanwhile, the legacy media and far-left journalists and activists told us that this was just a reckoning with our own history, that the destruction of sacred religious places wasn't really violence, and that the burning of these churches was actually understandable. That was what Trudeau's former top advisor, Gerald Butts, the guy who resigned in shame after trying to coerce Attorney General Jody Wilson-Raybould to interfere in a criminal investigation against the Liberals' friends SNC-Lavalin, that guy, the guy that resigned. Well, he said that it was understandable that the churches were being burned down. He thought it was understandable for a group of far-left protesters to burn down churches on First Nations reserves, Indigenous churches attended by First Nations people. He thought that that was understandable in the name of reconciliation. That's just how progressive he is. Well, all this anger and all these protests are promoted and cheerleaded by the legacy media when the cause is on the far left. But now that the large movement is calling for freedom, now that the protests are calling for an end to the lockdowns, an end to the medical tyranny, well, of course, the tune in the media has changed. So rather than use this as an opportunity for reflection or a national conversation, the way that the large protests when it came to climate change or Black Lives Matter or residential schools, how those all led to social movements, instead, when the large crowds are calling for freedom, they get demonized in the media, either ignored or demonized. And listen to this. This is a way that Justin Trudeau describes these protesters.
Yes, there is a small fringe element in this country that is angry, that doesn't believe in science, that is lashing out with racist, misogynistic attacks. But Canadians, the vast majority of Canadians, are not represented by them. And I know will not allow those voices, those special interest groups, those protesters who can, I don't even want to call them protesters, those anti-vaxxer mobs.
Did you hear that? He doesn't even think these Canadians deserve to be called protesters because that's too complimentary. He would rather just call them every negative name in the book, every name that he's been calling conservatives for years and years and years. Of course, according to the media, according to people like Justin Trudeau, when protesters on the left are angry, it's justified, it's excused, and it's even celebrated. But when it's protesters who are on the right or protesters who just want freedom, it's because they're racist and misogynistic. Oh, and if you don't agree with forced vaccinations, even for people who don't want them, well, it's because you must hate science. That is Trudeau's politicized version of science, where his opinion is the science, capital T, capital S, the science. Now, for the second weekend in a row, things got tense, things got a little ugly at a Trudeau rally. This is what happened in London, Ontario. So you can see the People's Party of Canada, the PPC, their activists showed up in drones to boo the Liberal leader and give him a piece of their mind. Trudeau is widely hated by Canadians. In fact, polling showed a full 41% of Canadians strongly dislike Justin Trudeau. Well, here is what that dislike looks like. People don't like Trudeau, that's perfectly legitimate. This sort of protest is perfectly legitimate. Regardless, here is what Trudeau's brain trust, Gerald Butts, the same guy who said it was understandable to burn down churches, here he is pushing a bizarre conspiracy theory that these PPC protesters are actually just stealth conservative disruptors trying to swing things in Erin O'Toole's favor. So here's his tweet. He says, "It's amazing how these protesters always show up to disrupt Trudeau events in Southern Ontario ridings that are Liberal Party, Conservative Party fights." And then he has this sort of confused face. Right. So Gerald Butts is suggesting here that what PPC supporters really want is an Erin O'Toole government. Has Gerald Butts ever spoken to a PPC supporter? Has he ever read their comments online? Has he ever been exposed to PPC at all? Because the last thing that a PPC supporter would want would be for Erin O'Toole to win. That's not what they want. That's not what they're trying to do. It's hard to fathom that this guy once got paid to give his opinion to anyone, let alone the Prime Minister of Canada. His bad takes got even worse when he started accusing my colleagues over at the Toronto Sun of, well, get this, starting a fire. He writes, "It's going to be special watching Sun Post Media people like this guy and Laurie Goldstein speed away from the fire they spent the last decade lighting." This is a guy that said lighting First Nation churches was understandable. What a fool. Well, things truly got a little ugly at that protest in London, Ontario. As Trudeau was getting on the bus, someone in the crowd started throwing gravel or pebbles or some kind of debris at Trudeau. Here is what that looked like. Now, it's hard to overstate. This is incredibly stupid behavior in more ways than one. First of all, to the idiot who threw something in Trudeau's direction. You are a disgrace. This is absolutely no way to behave in a civilized society, and everyone out there condemns you. Everyone condemns you. Second, Your idiotic actions allowed Trudeau to take the high road and pretend that this campaign is about you, about the protesters, and not about him. Now, let me just state this again. This is exactly what Trudeau wants. This is what the media want. They want to be talking about this. They want to be talking about angry, far-right protesters who somehow pose a threat to the country. They don't want to be talking about Trudeau. They don't want to be talking about his record. They want to be talking about the fringe far-right. And so when idiots like the guy who threw pebbles at the Liberal leader behave this way, it allows Trudeau to play the good guy, to play the hero, and to stand up for the people around him, including the journalists who are cheering him on. This allows him to change the narrative in his favor, and that's exactly what he did. And this allowed him to make this speech.
Let me be very clear and state the obvious first and foremost. It is absolutely unacceptable that people be throwing things and endangering others at a political rally. There were volunteers and supporters. There are police officers there to keep everyone safe. There were journalists such as yourselves doing a really important job informing Canadians of what's going on in this election and some of the tensions that are out there. Nobody should be doing their jobs under the threat or under the threats of violence or acts that put them in danger. That's absolutely unacceptable. But it's not just at political rallies that this is happening. There are healthcare workers across the country who are getting hassled and intimidated and bullied as they're going into work to keep people safe and alive. There are store clerks and waitresses and people going out there around their daily lives getting yelled at and pushed around for wearing masks, for being vaccinated. That's not how we do things in Canada. And quite frankly, as I continue to campaign, I am inspired by those people who continue to do the right thing in the face of anti-vaxxer mobs who are not respecting the basic science and the basic decency that Canadians have rightly come to expect from each other. This is not who we are as a country, and I will continue to stand up to defend journalists, police officers, healthcare workers, anyone in this country who has done the right thing, gotten themselves vaccinated, wants to get back to normal. Nobody should be getting that kind of intimidation or endangerment that these angry mobs are putting forward.
I said this on the show last week, but this is Trudeau's favorite iteration of himself. This is what Trudeau loves to do. He loves to be able to take the high road. He loves to be able to defend the little people, say that he's inspired by the little people. He loves to be able to just make a little shout out to the journalists, the people who are watching the speech, make sure that they know that he's on their side, that he loves them, that he wants to protect them. Make all those journalists who are watching feel warm and fuzzy towards the Prime Minister. That is what he wants. That is what they want. And of course, lo and behold, look at this headline. Look at what the CBC ran. This is exactly what Trudeau wants to be talking about. He doesn't want to be talking about his record in office. He doesn't want to be talking about his ethics violation. He doesn't want to talk about the debt. He doesn't want to talk about his pandemic vanity election. And he doesn't want to be talking about his failing campaign. He wants to be pitting Canadians against each other. He wants to be running a divisive campaign that he writes off part of the population as being anti-science, anti-vaxxers, and he wants headlines like this one in the CBC. Look at this headline. Does this surprise anyone? Goes exactly with Trudeau's narrative. It says, "We will not let them win," Trudeau says after being pelted with gravel during campaign stop. Liberal leader says he's inspired by frontline workers. Now, we know that could have been written by a partisan Liberal, that could have been a Liberal news release, but instead it is a CBC news story that will be viewed by millions of Canadians. So we know if you give Trudeau an inch, if you give his friends in the legacy media an inch, they will take a mile. And let me tell you this, they would much, much, much rather be talking about one unhinged protester who threw a rock at Justin Trudeau than any other issue on this campaign. I'm Candice Malcolm, and this is The Candice Malcolm Show.